The funeral of Mrs. Eunice Carble was never expected to be a lively affair, but even by Flaxborough standards it had begun with an air of dutiful gloom so unbroken that several mourners had already considered whether they might, without impropriety, begin thinking about lunch. A thin drizzle, having drifted over from the coast with all the aimlessness of a bored relative, now dampened hats, hymn sheets, and those fragile resolutions people make about keeping shoes polished for solemn occasions. The organist, a gentle man whose chief fault lay in treating every hymn as though it were an apology, played the opening bars of Abide With Me in a manner that suggested he hoped to be finished before the congregation properly noticed. But it was precisely at this point, as the pallbearers lifted Mrs. Carble toward the open grave, that the incident occurred. A small, elegant mahogany box slid from beneath the folds of the funeral wreath and struck the sodden grass with a surprisingly crisp thickness. Several ladies gasped. Mr. Pauling from the post office let out a sound reminiscent of a startled teapot. The vicar hesitated mid-prayer, casting about for guidance from God or the undertaker, whichever proved faster. The box lay perfectly centered between two headstones, as though placed with conscious precision by someone with an eye for symmetry. Rain darkened its polished surface, but a single brass latch glinted in a way that suggested it ought not to be opened by anyone short of a solicitor or a villain. Mrs. Lucetta Grimbley, who regarded funerals as both moral duty and competitive sport, leaned forward with such enthusiasm that her black veil swung like a pendulum, marking the seconds of outrage. "Well," she whispered, loud enough for half the churchyard to benefit, that certainly wasn't in the order of service. Some accounts varied wildly, later murmured that Mrs. Carble must have wished the box to be buried with her. Someone else, more pessimistic, remarked that the deceased might have taken to smuggling items even in death, a habit her long-suffering late husband had been widely assumed to endure in life. But before any consensus could form, the pallbearers halted. Then they looked at one another for advice, then at the vicar, then at the mahogany box, and finally at the vicar again, because few objects inspire moral paralysis, quite like a sealed container appearing at a burial uninvited. From the edge of the gathering, a man coughed not loudly, but with the kind of dry, thoughtful tone belonging to someone who had observed enough human behavior to know when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Inspector Walter Purbright, coat collar turned neatly against the drizzle, stepped forward with the politeness of a man accustomed to intruding gently on events people would much prefer remained undisturbed. "I don't believe," he said mildly, "that funerals generally include surprises of this nature." This remark, reaching the congregation, like a pebble dropped into shallow water, produced the requisite ripple of whispers. Purbright bent down, lifting the box with careful, almost tender regard. It was unexpectedly heavy, not the heaviness of metal, but the more troubling weight of something that ought to be light but wasn't. The vicar, a man who possessed a theological stance on nearly everything, found himself at a profound loss. His expression flickered between ecclesiastical authority and a timid hope that someone else might suggest a course of action. Purbright spared him the ordeal. "Perhaps," he murmured, "we might proceed with the service while this little mystery is considered." The mourners were more than willing. Funerals, after all, offered few opportunities for diversion, and the idea that this one might contain a hint of impropriety was precisely the sort of thing Flaxborough would discuss with relish before the ground had even settled on Mrs. Carble. By the time the service concluded, two things had already become certain among the whispering clusters of attendees. First, the mysterious box had emphatically not been delivered by any official party, and second, the late Mrs. Carble, who had lived a mostly blameless life, punctuated by regular complaints about the price of laundry starch, had never been thought of as the type to keep secrets. Naturally, therefore, everyone agreed that she must have harbored a spectacular one. Inspector Purbright, box tucked discreetly beneath his arm, could not help noticing the flickers of speculation dancing across the assembled faces. Flaxborough's citizens did not need facts to begin forming conclusions. Indeed, they often preferred to form the conclusions first and let facts be admitted later only if they behaved. As he made his way toward the gate, Sergeant Love, earnest and slightly breathless from trying to keep pace with the inspector's modest stride, ventured, "Do you think it's something serious, sir?" Purbright smiled with the faintest trace of sympathy for the young man. "My dear Love," he replied, "everything in Flaxborough is serious to someone." Behind them, the town's gossip, far more efficient than any telegraph, was already preparing to sprint ahead. Inspector Purbright walked from the churchyard with the discreet mahogany box resting against his side like a modest but insistent reminder that Mrs. Eunice Carble's funeral would not surrender to peaceful routine. The drizzle had softened into a mist that blurred the gravestones, giving the whole scene an air of hesitant farewell, though the townsfolk themselves showed no such reluctance. They streamed toward the gate with the collective urgency of people who felt certain that the dead had just bestowed upon them an irresistible conversational opportunity. Purbright felt, rather than heard, their speculations swelling behind him like the low hum of a hive, deciding which unfortunate flower to descend upon next. Sergeant Love stayed a half-step behind, casting frequent glances at the box with the sort of respectful anxiety normally reserved for volatile parishioners. Purbright offered him a mild reassurance in the form of silence, which in Flaxborough's police tradition counted as encouragement. They walked toward the police car, the sound of wet gravel crunching underfoot, and Love's voice finally emerged, small but earnest, as though fearful of disturbing whatever lay inside the box. "Sir, do you expect Mrs. Carble might have been mixed up in something unsavory?" Purbright replied with the gentleness of a man nudging a puzzle piece into its proper place. "I think, Love, that unsavoriness is rarely found in the activities people publicly deny. More often, it hides in the things they never think to mention at all." The inspector placed the box on the back seat with the same care one might use for a sleeping infant. Love slid into the front beside him, adjusting his cap with the solemnity of someone bracing for potential revelation. As Purbright settled in, he felt the lingering tremor of the moment at the graveside, the pallbearer's halted steps, the vicar's uncertainty, the murmured suspicions that fluttered like startled birds. What interested him was not the dramatic appearance of the box, but the quick, almost involuntary expressions among the mourners. Tiny flinches, raised eyebrows, abruptly tightened lips. Such responses, Purbright knew, came not from curiosity but from recognition. They drove the short distance to the station, observing Flaxborough in its typical afternoon posture. Laundrette steam fogging the windows like opaque breath, a small cluster of school children kicking something indeterminate along the pavement, and Mrs. Grimbley marching home with her veil bobbing in indignation as though still protesting the incident on theological grounds. The town often appeared half asleep, yet its gossip network woke at the slightest provocation. By now, Purbright suspected, theories about the box ranged from smuggled jewels to an overdue library book someone believed should have been returned decades earlier. Inside the station's modest inquiry room, Purbright placed the box upon the table. It looked strangely poised, as if confident of its importance. Love stood nearby with the stiff posture of a man awaiting his cue. Purbright observed the box for a long moment before speaking. "You see, Love, the trouble with objects that appear where they shouldn't is that someone always meant them to. Chance rarely has such tidy handwriting." Love nodded at this, almost relieved to have something he could repeat later with authority. The latch clicked easily beneath Purbright's thumb, though he paused just before opening it fully, attuned to the faintest hesitation in his own mind. The weight had been surprising. The contents might be equally so. When the lid finally lifted, both men leaned slightly closer, though Purbright's expression remained carefully neutral. Inside, resting upon a square of faded velvet, lay what appeared to be a small bundle of folded paper tied with a worn blue ribbon. Nothing more. No jewels, no documents that glowed with danger, no threatening tokens. Just paper, though the ribbon, frayed at the edges, bore the unmistakable look of something kept and handled with sentiment rather than utility. Love exhaled in a soft mixture of disappointment and confusion. Is that all? Purbright did not answer immediately. He removed the bundle, noting the faint scent of lavender as old as the memories it had been pressed against. He untied the ribbon with gentle precision, as though to avoid disturbing the past unnecessarily. The papers unfolded into a series of letters, written in a looping, hesitant hand, letters addressed not to Mrs. Carble, but from her, and each one ended with the same initial flourish. E.C., followed by a small heart drawn in a manner both embarrassed and earnest. Love, attempting discretion but failing to disguise curiosity, ventured, "Love letters, sir?" Purbright's lips formed a mild smile. Something very like that, I should think. Though whether they were written to her late husband or to someone else is what we must determine. Love blinked several times, his mind adjusting itself to this new possibility. There was a silence that seemed to lengthen deliberately, as though the room itself waited to hear what might be written in those faded lines. Purbright glanced through the first letter. The writing was affectionate, intimate in tone but vague in particulars, as if the writer feared both discovery and omission. Yet it contained small geographical references, meeting places, times of day, remarks about flowers in a window that suggested secrecy rather than simple marital fondness. If they had been exchanged publicly, the letters would hardly have found their way into a box deposited at a funeral. "It appears," Purbright murmured, "that Mrs. Carble was not quite as unremarkable as her neighbors believed, and someone, knowing this, chose today to ensure the truth found an audience. But not too directly, mind you. Flaxborough favors its scandals seasoned, not served raw." Love shifted uneasily. "Whoever dropped it off, sir, must have been close by." Purbright nodded. "Indeed, close enough to know which moment would cause the greatest flutter, and close enough to risk being seen. But they were confident, Love confident, that the shock would distract everyone from watching too closely. That sort of confidence is rarely accidental." He gathered the letters into a neat stack, retied the ribbon, and closed the box with deliberate calm. "We shall have to speak to several people, Love, beginning, I think, with those who knew Mrs. Carble well enough to recognize her handwriting, or well enough to fear it." Outside the inquiry room window, the mist had thickened into a soft, persistent fog that wrapped Flaxborough like a half-kept secret. Purbright regarded it with an expression of quiet contemplation. The town, so fond of imagining itself ordinary, had once again revealed its favorite contradiction, that nothing provoked its citizens more than the possibility that one of them had lived a life of private complexity. Love, gathering his notebook, asked, "Who should we see first, sir?" Purbright reached for his coat. Someone who was watching the funeral very closely, but doing their best not to appear so. Someone whose face stiffened just a fraction more than the others when the box fell. Someone, Love, who knows exactly what is in these letters. And as they stepped out into the soft grey afternoon, Flaxborough's quiet streets seemed to lean inward, waiting with well-practiced eagerness for the next development. The fog lingered like a quiet accomplice as Purbright and Sergeant Love made their way toward the modest terraced houses on Brookleat Road, where Mrs. Carble's closest acquaintance, Mrs. Winifred Albury, was known to spend most afternoons guarding her lace curtains from sunlight and neighbors alike. Purbright had noted at the funeral the brief but unmistakable tightening around her mouth when the mahogany box struck the wet grass, a flicker of reaction too swift for most to register, but not too swift for him. In Flaxborough, people revealed only what they believed harmless, The inspector had made a career of observing what they hadn't meant to reveal at all. Mrs. Albury answered the door with the prim readiness of someone who expected visitors to justify their presence before crossing the threshold. Her hair, set in firm, silvery coils, bore an authority that even the damp air seemed reluctant to disturb. When she saw Purbright, her expression rearranged itself into something approximating polite welcome, though the effort lacked enthusiasm. "Inspector Purbright," she said with a nod that performed the work of a handshake. "I suppose you've come about the dreadful scene at poor Eunice's funeral. I knew from the moment that Box appeared that something would stir up the town. They never can leave sorrow in peace here." "May we come in?" Purbright asked gently. "We won't keep you long." Mrs. Albury hesitated just long enough to signal her disapproval of intrusion before stepping aside. The parlor was warm in a stifling sort of way, as though heated by an ongoing argument between floral wallpaper and thick velvet drapes. She gestured them toward a sofa that bore the rigid posture of furniture not yet resigned to being sat upon. Love eased himself onto the very edge while Purbright remained standing, taking in the meticulous order of the room. Coasters aligned in strict geometry, photographs dusted into reflective submission, a sewing basket whose lid sat closed with the firmness of a secret unwilling to be disturbed. "We are trying, Mrs. Albury," he began, "to understand how the box came to be at Mrs. Carble's graveside. You were standing quite close at the time." She pressed her lips together, the motion recalling the earlier tightening he had noticed. "Quite close, yes. Eunice and I were neighbors for 23 years. I saw her through her troubles, and she saw me through mine, though I had the decency not to go advertising them." Purbright inclined his head, encouraging but not insistent. "You recognize the box?" "Recognize it?" She gave a soft sniff, only in the sense that it was completely foreign. Eunice was not the type to indulge in trinkets. If she had possessions of sentimental value, she kept them discreet. Some women, Inspector, find it vulgar to splash their emotions in wooden containers. He allowed the comment to settle like dust in a room where no dust was permitted. "Mrs. Albury," he said quietly, "did Mrs. Carble ever confide in you? About friendships outside Flaxborough, for instance?" The older woman looked briefly offended, then thoughtful, then determinedly neutral. "Eunice was loyal to her husband," she said carefully. "Very loyal." Purbright did not correct her phrasing, but noted the absence of certainty behind the repetition. Loyalty in Flaxborough was measured less by truth than by how convincingly one announced it. He opened the box, untied the ribbon, and drew out the top letter, laying it silently on the tea table. Mrs. Albury's eyes narrowed, curiosity wrestling with self-restraint. "We found these inside," he said. "They are written in Mrs. Carble's hand. Would you mind looking?" She did mind, quite obviously, but to refuse would have been to declare some connection she was not yet prepared to articulate. With a brisk motion, she lifted the letter, read only the first few lines, and placed it back down as though it had unexpectedly warmed between her fingers. "I cannot imagine," she said, her voice steadier than her expression, "why Eunice would write such things. She was never a romantic woman. Sensible. Very sensible. If she wrote letters, Inspector, I expect they were never intended for anyone to see." Purbright observed her with the mild interest one might give to a person recounting a dream they wished to forget. "Mrs. Albury, you were the first to react when the box fell, very slightly but noticeably. Did you expect something else to appear at the funeral?" Her eyes widened, then closed for a moment with the slow exhale of someone gathering a defensive formation. "Inspector, funerals are emotional affairs. Seeing something unexpected, particularly something so brazen, would make anyone react. As for expectation, I had none. Eunice lived quietly. She died quietly, and I would prefer her memory to remain that way." Love scribbled notes which bore little resemblance to her phrasing but captured enough sentiment to be useful. Later. Purbright, however, saw the hesitation, the guardedness, subtle signs that Mrs. Albury knew more than she wanted to confess. "Thank you, Mrs. Albury," he said, retrieving the letter. "You've been very helpful." She looked faintly alarmed by this assertion, as though accidental helpfulness were a punishable offense. "If someone placed that box there," she said abruptly, "perhaps they wanted to shame Eunice, or her husband. People can be cruel, Inspector. Crueler than you might think." Purbright gave her a gentle smile. "In my experience, Mrs. Albury, people are rarely cruel without a reason, and rarely kind without one either." Outside, the fog had thinned to a pale silver veil as they walked back toward town. Love cleared his throat. "She wasn't telling the whole truth, sir." "No," said Purbright mildly. "But she told me enough. Someone wanted Mrs. Carble's private life to become very public today, and Mrs. Albury knew precisely whom Eunice wrote those letters to." Love hesitated. "Should we go back and ask her directly?" Purbright shook his head. "No, love. People reveal the truth best when they believe you already know it, and we, of course, do not yet. But we shall speak to someone who does." "Who's that, sir?" Purbright turned toward the market square, where the fog lifted just enough to show the town beginning its evening routines, each person moving with the comfort of habit and the unease of fresh scandal. "Someone, love, whose name appears in these letters." The fog had retreated into wisps that clung to lampposts and gutters as Purbright and Sergeant Love began their walk toward the library, a building whose square, slightly gloomy architecture suggested it disapproved of frivolity or sunlight in any form. Purbright moved with the contemplative steadiness of a man assembling a jigsaw whose pieces had been cut deliberately imprecise. Love followed in attentive silence, aware that the name appearing in the letters mentioned only once, and with coy delicacy was enough to send them in a direction Mrs. Albury had hoped they would not travel. The door of the library bore the faint squeak of an institution long accustomed to cautious entrances. Inside, the air smelled pleasantly of paper aging at varying speeds, accompanied by the faint aroma of floor polish and morally disapproving tea. At a small wooden desk sat Mr. Lionel Acton, the assistant librarian, a man whose posture suggested that even his skeleton observed the rules of quiet conduct. He adjusted his spectacles upon seeing the inspector, though his expression remained politely opaque. "Good afternoon, Mr. Acton," Purbright said, offering a small nod. "We wonder if we might impose upon you for a moment or two." Acton closed his ledger with ceremonious care. "If it concerns overdue books, Inspector, I assure you we have several persistent offenders far more deserving of your attention than any criminal enterprise." His attempt at humor, like most of Acton's social gestures, seemed borrowed from someone more confident. "Not overdue books," Purbright replied gently. "Rather, a name, one we believe you may be familiar with." He placed the box upon the desk and withdrew a single letter, unfolded just enough to show the delicate stroke of the name Lionel without exposing its accompanying sentiment. Acton's composure stiffened like damp laundry meeting a strong gust. "That appears to be my name," he said quietly, "though not, I think, my handwriting." Purbright regarded him with mild appreciation for understatement. "The letters are from Mrs. Eunice Carble. They were found today at her funeral. The mahogany box was placed at the graveside by someone whose intention is not yet clear. We hoped you might shed a little light on the nature of your acquaintance with Mrs. Carble." Acton's hand twitched toward the letter but did not dare reach it. He clasped his fingers together instead, forming a neat lattice that nevertheless trembled slightly. Mrs. Carble was a patron of the library, a very regular one. She enjoyed novels of the gentler sort, gardens, domestic trials, little triumphs of human character. We spoke often about books, Inspector. Only books. Love scribbled with the vigor of someone confident that elaboration would follow. But Acton's mouth pressed into a thin, decisive line that suggested his statement had reached its full length. Purbright, however, was patient. "Mrs. Carble wrote to you," he said softly. "These letters were kept carefully, tied with a ribbon. It appears they mattered to her." Acton swallowed. The small click of his throat carried loudly in the library's hush. "Inspector, if those are letters of affection, I assure you they're misdirected. Mrs. Carble was a charming woman, quiet and thoughtful, but I am not a man accustomed to receiving attention of that nature. My position here is modest. My life is also modest." He made a small, helpless gesture, as though hoping his modesty might extend itself into a shield. "Were you aware of these letters at all?" Purbright asked. Acton shook his head. "Never. If Mrs. Carble had written such things, she certainly did not send them. And if she meant them for me, she must have changed her mind. I cannot imagine why anyone would reveal them now." The distress of the thought softened into a perplexed sadness, hinting at something unspoken, perhaps a quiet affection he had never dared to reciprocate. Purbright studied him with a faint narrowing of the eyes. A man like Acton, gentle in temperament and lacking in vanity, was unlikely to orchestrate a public scandal, but he might easily become the unwilling protagonist of one. "Do you recall anyone taking unusual interest in Mrs. Carble?" he asked, "or observing the two of you speaking in a way that might encourage assumptions?" Acton hesitated. "People observe everything in Flaxborough, Inspector, whether they intend to or not. But if you mean someone who watched us particularly—" He paused again, collecting caution like loose coins. "Mrs. Albury, perhaps. She was a very devoted neighbor, protective even. Sometimes she lingered near the shelves when Mrs. Carble and I talked. I assume she disapproved of my recommending novels that weren't quite dignified enough." Purbright felt a small but distinct alignment of pieces. Mrs. Albury's guardedness, her mention of cruelty, the letters that had never been sent yet preserved with tenderness. He could almost hear the gears of Flaxborough's social machinery creaking into motion. "One more question, Mr. Acton. Did Mrs. Carble ever speak to you about her husband?" Acton's expression softened. "Yes. She said he was a man of routine and caution. Not unkind, but inattentive. She once said she had learned to grow her inner life quietly, since her outer one demanded so little of her." Acton looked as though he feared the intimacy of repeating such words. "Thank you, Mr. Acton," Purbright said, closing the letter. "You've been most helpful." As they stepped back into the cooling dusk, Love exhaled as though emerging from a sermon. "Sir, do you think he's telling the truth?" Purbright nodded gently. "Mostly, but he is hiding regret. And regret, Love, can be mistaken for guilt when observed through the wrong pair of eyes." Love frowned thoughtfully. "Mrs. Albury's eyes, sir." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. "Or someone else's. Someone who believed Mrs. Carble's affection needed to be revealed at the most inconvenient moment possible. Someone who wanted to disturb the funeral not out of malice, but from a sense of wounded righteousness." They reached the corner of Market Street, where the pub windows glowed with the gentle amber light of early evening, and voices drifted out in small bursts, speculation growing in confident leaps. Purbright glanced toward the car, and then toward the direction of the Carble home. "Love, I think we should pay a visit to Mr. Carble." Love looked startled. "Her husband, sir. Do you think he knew about the letters?" Purbright began walking, the shadows lengthening ahead of them. "I think he knew something. Not necessarily what was written, but that something existed. Something his wife kept close. And people who suspect they're being excluded from affection often respond in ways they later insist were perfectly reasonable." The wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and distant damp earth. Purbright understood then that they were moving toward the first significant disturbance of the investigation, not the letters themselves, but the reactions they would evoke. And Flaxborough, which never failed to hide its deepest truths in plain sight, was preparing to show him another. The Carbel residence sat on a quiet crescent where the houses, though modest, carried an air of upright self-respect, as if determined to avoid the slightest suggestion of disorder. A dim porch lamp cast a soft yellow glow across the steps as Purbright and Sergeant Love approached. The curtains were drawn, but not fully. A narrow gap revealed a sliver of lamplight inside, suggesting the inhabitant was home and, perhaps, attempting to decide whether callers should be welcomed or regretted. Mr. Edgar Carbel opened the door before they knocked. His expression held the weary politeness of a man who had practiced sorrow so frequently that he had begun to tire of the performance. His eyes, pale and watchful, shifted between the two officers with mild apprehension. "Inspector Purbright," he said, standing aside with stiff courtesy. "I suppose you have questions." Purbright entered with gentle pace, allowing the hush of the house to settle around them. The sitting room bore the marks of long domestic caution. Furniture arranged to discourage improvisation, decorative bowls emptied of anything that might tempt misplacement, and a mantelpiece displaying photographs in impeccable alignment. There was very little evidence of Eunice Carbel's personality. Love, noting this, scribbled with more sympathy than suspicion. "We are grateful for a moment of your time, Mr. Carbel," Purbright said, lowering himself into a chair that creaked in a tone of reluctant hospitality. "I understand today must have been difficult." Carbel let out a thin breath. Funerals are difficult enough without theatrics. That box he paused, searching for language that might prevent offense. "It was a damned nuisance, Inspector. Terribly disrespectful to Eunice." Purbright nodded, handling the subject with deliberate calm. The box contained a collection of letters. "Written by your wife." Carbel stiffened, though his expression did not change dramatically. Rather, it was the small tightening near the eyes, as though the air had weighed suddenly upon him. "Is that so?" he asked softly. "I wasn't aware Eunice had correspondence of that nature." Purbright studied him with the mild, polite scrutiny that often coaxed truth from reluctant corners. "They were affectionate letters," he said. "Undelivered. Tied carefully with a ribbon. It seems they were private rather than hidden." Carbel looked away, his jaw twitching. "Eunice was entitled to her privacy, Inspector. She was a good wife, steady and reasonable. If she kept thoughts to herself, I respected that. Marriage cannot thrive if every sentiment becomes a discussion." Love, uncertain whether that was wisdom or evasion, made note of it. Purbright folded his hands. "Did you know the recipient?" "A Mr. Lionel Acton." Carbel blinked at the name, then sighed with a mixture of resignation and faint irritation. "The librarian?" "Yes, Eunice spoke of him occasionally. She said he recommended her books. I assume that was the extent of it." Purbright let the words settle, observing the way Carbel's fingers fiddled with the cuff of his sleeve, an unconscious movement revealing tension he otherwise concealed. "Did you attend the library with her?" "Rarely. Books were her domain, not mine. I prefer newspapers' facts, not stories. Eunice, however, she liked the gentler worlds." He paused again, then added with notable care, "I never thought she would form attachments beyond her reading." "But did you suspect someone else might think she had?" Purbright asked. Carbel looked up sharply. "Suspicion requires imagination, Inspector. I'm not built for that. If others had ideas, they kept them from me." He hesitated, then added, as though the words were an unwanted admission, "Mrs. Albury was fond of implying impropriety where none existed. She worried about everything. If she thought Eunice and the librarian were connected, she would likely have told half the town." That observation brought a quiet spark of calculation to Purbright's eyes. "You think she spread rumors?" Carbel frowned. "Rumors? No," Hints, perhaps. She was protective of Eunice, but in her own way, rather controlling. Eunice admired her loyalty, though sometimes I felt it strangled her. The sentiment hung in the air with the weight of an unspoken grievance. Purbright leaned forward slightly. "Did your wife seem troubled in recent months?" Carble hesitated long enough to give the answer more meaning than the words themselves. She seemed distant at times, not unhappy, but preoccupied. She had a softness to her thoughts lately, as if she were imagining something she couldn't quite claim. I didn't press her. Pressing would have been unkind. Purbright regarded him closely. "So you had no knowledge of the letters, or who might have placed the box at the funeral?" "None," Carble replied. "But whoever did it wanted humiliation, Inspector. Not for Eunice, she's beyond anyone's cruelty now. For me." His voice trembled not with despair, but with the indignation of a private man whose dignity had been handled roughly. Love shifted in his chair, suddenly sympathetic. Purbright considered Carble's words with their earnest steadiness and the faint undercurrent of wounded pride. A man wronged, but not vindictive. Purbright rose, offering a small inclination of respect. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Carble. We may need to speak further, but you've clarified more than you know." Carble stood as well, his posture rigid, but his eyes unexpectedly damp. Whoever placed that box there, Inspector, they knew Eunice. They knew what her quietness meant, and they knew how to wound it. As Purbright stepped out into the evening air, Love fell into stride beside him, brow furrowed. "Sir, that didn't sound like a man hiding guilt." "No, Love," Purbright said gently, "but it sounded very much like a man unaware of someone else's." Love looked puzzled. "Someone close to Mrs. Carble, or someone close enough to observe her loneliness with resentment," Purbright replied softly. "Someone who mistook affection kept quietly within one's heart for betrayal." The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves along the path, echoing the stir of tension now drifting through Flaxborough. Purbright felt the subtle shift in the investigation, not dramatic, but decisive, like a chess piece moved by someone who believed their strategy unnoticed. And he knew the next step would require listening not only to what the townspeople said, but to the silences they chose so carefully to keep. The night drew its curtains early over Flaxborough, leaving the streets in a hush that felt more contemplative than silent, as though the town itself were mulling over the scandal set loose among its tidy hedgerows. Purbright and Sergeant Love walked back toward the station, their pace unhurried, each absorbed in thoughts shaped by Mr. Carble's quiet indignation. Street lamps flickered into life one by one, giving the cobbles a muted sheen that softened the sharp edges of the day's revelations. Inside the station, Purbright lowered himself into his chair with the slow, thoughtful composure of someone rearranging the pieces of an intricate puzzle. Love remained standing a moment, unsure whether to sit or await instruction. He finally perched on the edge of his own chair, notebook ready, the dense scrawl on the pages already beginning to resemble a tangle of overheard confessions. "Sir," Love began tentatively, "if neither Mr. Carble nor Mr. Acton knew about the letters, and Mrs. Albury pretended not to, who'd have put that box at the funeral? Someone must have known about those letters to collect them in the first place." Purbright nodded, lifting the mahogany box from the desk and running his fingers along its edges, as though it might reveal its story through touch alone. Someone did know, Love. Someone close enough to Mrs. Carble to have access to her private things. Someone who believed their actions justified, perhaps even righteous. Love frowned. But why choose the funeral? Why not come to you directly or confront Mr. Carble? "Because," Purbright replied with gentle certainty, "some people believe the truth only has meaning when delivered at the moment of greatest vulnerability. A misguided virtue, to be sure. But Flaxborough has never lacked for citizens eager to shape their neighbors' reputations." He opened the box again, the letters lying as placidly as they had when first discovered. Purbright lifted the topmost sheet, scanning its tender lines. "What strikes me most, love, is that the letters were never posted. They were not declarations, but contemplation thoughts Eunice Carble could not speak, perhaps even feared to acknowledge. Someone found these and assumed the worst." Love rubbed his forehead. "Or wanted others to assume the worst." "Quite so," Purbright murmured. "And I suspect that person knows Mrs. Carble far more intimately than anyone has admitted." He closed the box with a soft click and stood abruptly, smoothing down his coat. "Come along, love. There's one more place we must visit before the night grows late. The place where truth and resentment so often share a teapot." Love blinked. "Mrs. Albury's again, sir." "Not yet. Someone else first. Someone who saw everything at the funeral but tried very hard to appear invisible. Someone who commented rather freely, if I recall correctly, on propriety." Love's eyes widened. "Mrs. Grimbley." "Indeed, love. A woman who treats scandal as a civic obligation." They stepped out into the cool evening, the fog sharpening into thin strands across the road. Mrs. Lucetta Grimbley lived in a house that managed to look both immaculate and disapproving, as though cleanliness were a moral stance rather than a preference. When Purbright knocked, the door opened a half-inch, then a full one, revealing her stern silhouette framed by an unlit hallway. "Inspector Purbright," she said, adjusting her black mourning veil as though it were armor. "I suppose you've come to ask about that dreadful spectacle today." Purbright offered her a small bow of acknowledgement. "If it's not too inconvenient, Mrs. Grimbley, we hoped you might spare us a few minutes." "Convenience, Inspector, is a luxury one sacrifices when justice is at stake. Please, come in." The interior was as rigidly arranged as its occupant chairs, aligned with geometric accuracy. Porcelain figures positioned as though awaiting inspection. Purbright sat with the politeness of a guest entering a room where conversations were expected to behave themselves. Mrs. Grimbley folded her hands and leaned forward slightly. "Now then, what is it you wish to know?" Purbright regarded her with patient calm. "We're trying to determine who placed the box at Mrs. Carble's funeral. You had a good view of the incident." Mrs. Grimbley sniffed with restrained disdain. "A disgraceful interruption. People ought to know better than to upset mourning rituals. Not that mourning comes naturally to everyone. Some people, Inspector, have always been poor examples of respectability." Purbright sensed the shift of judgment. "You refer to the contents of the box?" "I refer to tendencies, Inspector. Unseemly tendencies. Mrs. Carble was a decent woman, but decent women may be misled." She paused, searching for a word that would convey moral authority without exposing personal spite. "Impressionable," she concluded. Purbright nodded. "Did you ever observe anything between Mrs. Carble and Mr. Acton?" Mrs. Grimbley stiffened. "Observe? I observe everything. She visited the library often enough. Too often, in my opinion. Books are one thing, Inspector, but prolonged conversation with men is quite another. Still, I said nothing. Silence is sometimes kinder." Love nearly choked on a quiet cough. Purbright maintained composure. "Did you notice anyone else watching Mrs. Carble closely?" Mrs. Grimbley hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Albury, that woman has never been satisfied unless she is managing someone else's life. She hovered over Eunice like a hawk with sentimental ties, always arranging, advising, correcting. One might think she had been appointed guardian of Mrs. Carble's moral virtue." Purbright allowed the remark to settle. "And did Mrs. Albury appear upset at the funeral?" "Upset?" Mrs. Grimbley's eyes widened. She looked as though a secret she'd been guarding finally slipped through her fingers. "I saw her face, Inspector. She was not shocked. She was exposed. This, delivered with grave certainty, carried the scent of someone accustomed to interpreting guilt through expressions alone. Purbright noted the conviction but weighed it carefully. Mrs. Grimbley had never met a rumor she considered unworthy of belief. "Thank you, Mrs. Grimbley," he said, rising. "You've been most informative." As they stepped back into the street, Love exhaled deeply. "Sir, she really believes Mrs. Albury did it." "Belief, Love," Purbright replied gently, "is often shaped more by dislike than evidence." Still, Mrs. Grimbley provided something useful. She saw Mrs. Albury's reaction closely. And reactions, when genuine, tell more than declarations. Love pondered this as they walked. "So what now, sir?" Purbright slowed his steps, gazing toward the dim outline of Brookleat Road. "Now, Love, we return to the beginning. The person who placed that box acted out of a sense of moral necessity, not revenge, not spite. A misguided attempt at rescue, perhaps, and such attempts are rarely made by those merely watching from afar." The night air carried a distant sound of footsteps, soft but purposeful, as though someone else, somewhere in Flaxborough, had also decided that this evening was not yet finished. The walk back toward Brookleat Road carried a different weight now, as if the quiet pavements held a faint echo of footsteps belonging to someone who had long anticipated this moment. Purbright moved with unhurried certainty, and Love followed close behind, his expression drawn into a frown of earnest concentration. The fog returned in thin drafts, drifting like cautious spectators alongside them, and the street lamps gave off a wavering glow that made even familiar doorways seem poised to share a secret. When they reached Mrs. Albury's home, the windows were still lit, though the curtains had been drawn so tightly that not even a sliver of light escaped. Purbright knocked gently, and after a pause, long enough to register reluctance, the door opened. Mrs. Albury stood there wrapped in a shawl the color of polished coal, her face carefully composed, though her eyes flickered with the strain of someone awaiting an unavoidable question. "Inspector," she said, not unkindly but with unmistakable fatigue. "Again?" "Just a few moments more, Mrs. Albury," Purbright replied with a calm that invited neither evasion nor resistance. "There are developments." She stepped aside, allowing them to enter the same tidy parlor, though the room now felt altered, as though her earlier stiffness had seeped into the very furniture, leaving no space for comfort. Mrs. Albury seated herself with precise dignity. "I don't imagine," she said, "that you found anyone else prepared to cause such commotion today. Mrs. Grimbley, perhaps, though she prefers mischief to subtlety." Purbright settled opposite her, hands folded loosely. Mrs. Grimbley had quite a bit to say, but what interests me most is her observation of your reaction at the funeral. She said you looked exposed. Mrs. Albury stiffened, as though bracing herself against an unexpected draught. Mrs. Grimbley sees guilt wherever. There is grief, Inspector. It is her speciality. My reaction to my momentary startle was nothing more than shock. Who wouldn't be unsettled by such a deliberately dramatic interruption? Eunice deserved better. Purbright nodded. She did. And perhaps that is precisely why the letters were placed there, not to shame her, but to defend her, to protect her memory in a way someone believed necessary. Mrs. Albury's fingers tightened around each other. Protect her? From what? Eunice was admired, respected, loved? Purbright asked gently. The word hung between them, heavy and disruptive. Mrs. Albury's face softened in a way she had fought to prevent. Inspector Eunice was my dearest friend. We shared nearly everything. If she had been troubled by her husband or misled by that librarian, she would have said so. Purbright watched her, sensing that she had arrived at the edge of a truth she did not wish to face. But Mrs. Carble did have a private world, he said softly. One she did not share with you. These letters reveal not impropriety, but longing. A longing tenderly expressed, never acted upon. A longing someone believed would misunderstand itself unless revealed. Mrs. Albury's eyes glistened with a quiet ache. Eunice wrote letters? To that man? Why? He is hardly inspiring. Love coughed lightly at the unexpected bluntness. Purbright's tone remained steady. Sometimes affection finds its shape in places we don't expect, and sometimes what we think is loyalty becomes possession. The remark landed with precision. Mrs. Albury flinched. I would never possess Eunice. I was her support, her confidant. And yet, Purbright said gently, she kept these letters from you. Someone else, perhaps hoping to protect her reputation, discovered them. Someone who believed the letters represented a danger to her dignity. Someone who loved her enough to think the truth must be framed, not buried. Mrs. Albury closed her eyes briefly, a soft tremor passing through her shoulders. Inspector, are you saying She stopped herself, shaking her head sharply. No, I found no such letters. I was with Eunice the day before she died. She seemed content. Quiet, yes, but not distressed. Purbright leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mrs. Albury, did she give you anything? Something she asked you to keep safe? The question broke something in her. She exhaled slowly as though letting out a confession she had been resisting long before the inspector arrived. She gave me her sewing basket. She said it contained the last of her small private things and she didn't want Edgar rummaging through them after her passing. She told me to burn whatever I thought unnecessary. Love straightened abruptly. Sir. Purbright's eyes sharpened. And did you burn anything? Mrs. Albury hesitated, caught between propriety and conscience. I looked through it. There were notebooks, scraps of fabric, and letters from her sister. Nothing alarming, nothing romantic. If these letters existed, they cannot have been in the basket she gave me. Purbright nodded with slow, deliberate thought. So someone else had access to someone who visited her home after her death. Someone who believed they knew best what became of her belongings. Mrs. Albury's face was drained of color. Edgar. Her voice was barely a whisper. He insisted on sorting the house alone after the undertaker left. He told me to stay home and said it was my husband's responsibility, but Eunice never trusted him with her personal things. She said he wouldn't understand their value. Purbright rose gently. Thank you, Mrs. Albury. You've helped more than you realize. But as he reached the door, her voice trembled behind him. Inspector, if Edgar found those letters, why would he bring them to her funeral? Purbright paused, the fog outside swallowing his reflection in the glass. Because, Mrs. Albury, if he believed Eunice's affection had been wasted on an unsuitable man, or misinterpreted by others, he might decide the only way to restore her reputation was to control the narrative himself. Love blinked. To show the town she was innocent, or to appear the gracious, wronged husband, Purbright murmured. Flaxborough admires humility, especially when performed. They stepped outside, the cold air drawing a quiet breath around them. Love shivered. Sir, do you really think Mr. Carble planted the box? Purbright began walking, the night thickening gently around them. I think he knew of the letters. I think he feared what silence would allow others to imagine. But I don't yet know what he intended to gain. Love frowned. So you don't think he meant harm? Purbright's gaze drifted toward the dim outline of the Carble house. Harm is a matter of perspective, love. Some people cause more damage trying to protect someone than they ever would by telling the truth. And somewhere in Flaxborough, the truth had begun to bend quietly, purposefully under the weight of someone's idea of devotion. The mist thickened as Purbright and Love made their way back toward the station, gathering in gentle folds around the lamp-posts like a town reluctant to reveal too much too quickly. Love remained uncharacteristically quiet, his thoughts moving in circles around the idea that Edgar Cable might have been the one to bring the letters into the harsh light of public speculation. The man had seemed wounded, yes, but in a dignified, reserved way. Nothing about him had suggested the theatrical flourish of a box dropped at his wife's funeral. "Sir," Love ventured at last, "I still can't make sense of Mr. Carble's part in this. He didn't sound like a man trying to shape his reputation. He sounded lost." Purbright offered a small, contemplative hum. "People often sound lost when they're trying to maintain control, Love. It takes very little for grief to become defensive, especially when one fears being judged for feelings they would rather deny. But would he choose the funeral for such a gesture?" Love pressed. "It seems too public, too deliberate." "Precisely," Purbright murmured. "Mr. Carble does not strike me as a man who enjoys the spotlight, which means either he acted against his own nature out of a conviction he believed justified, or Purbright slowed his steps and someone else took advantage of his vulnerabilities." Love blinked, startled. Someone who knew about the letters without Mr. Carble telling them. Perhaps. Or someone who feared what the letters implied and sought to direct suspicion elsewhere. Love frowned, chewing over the thought. Mrs. Albury could have found the letters before Edgar if she ever opened that sewing basket. Purbright shook his head gently. She believes the letters were not there, and her distress was genuine, if inconveniently tangled with pride. No, if she discovered anything, it was later, perhaps by visiting the house after Eunice's death, but not before the funeral. Her surprise was authentic. Love hesitated. "Then who, sir? Someone else who visited their home?" Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he paused beneath a street lamp where the glow created a small island of clarity in the mist. "Consider the practical matter, Love. Whoever placed the box had to bring it without being noticed. They had to know the funeral arrangements. They had to anticipate precisely when the pallbearers would lift the coffin and when attention would be diverted. That sort of timing is not spontaneous." Love swallowed, suddenly uneasy. "Someone who was there early." "Someone who was always early," Purbright confirmed softly. "Someone who appoints themselves custodian of propriety." "Mrs. Grimbley?" Love asked, startled. "Possibly. But Mrs. Grimbley is too fond of commentary to rely on silence. She delights in observing impropriety, not manufacturing it. And she has no patience for nuance. No, this act required someone who believed the gesture was protective, not punitive. Someone who loved Eunice in a way that never found expression." Love stared at him. "You think Lionel Acton. I think Lionel Acton is a gentleman incapable of orchestrating such a spectacle. His affection, if it existed, was private, almost painfully so. No, Love. I suspect someone else entirely. Someone whose affection took another form of guardianship. Someone who resented the shift in Eunice's emotional life even if she herself never acted upon it." Love stopped walking. "Mrs. Albury again." Purbright's expression softened. "She may be involved, but not maliciously. However, someone close to her, someone who shares her vigilance, might have acted on her behalf. Someone who overheard her concerns, saw her fears, and interpreted them as instruction." Love's face cleared slightly. "A neighbor, a companion, a helper," Purbright said gently. "Someone unobtrusive, someone who assists regularly, moves through houses quietly, hears more than they're meant to, and someone who attends funerals because they consider it a civic duty." Love's eyes widened. "Miss Overby, the church verger's assistant?" Purbright gave a small nod. "She was there before the pallbearers arrived. She arranges the wreaths. She would have had ample opportunity to place the box discreetly, believing she was fulfilling some moral obligation. But why would she think Eunice needed defending?" Love asked. "Because Miss Overby is very close to Mrs. Albury," Purbright replied. "And Mrs. Albury, in her fretful devotion, may have spoken anxiously about Eunice's softened behavior, the letters she suspected but never admitted, the changes she feared Eunice was contemplating. Miss Overby, hearing this, might have believed Eunice's reputation was endangered and that the town needed to be shown the truth of her innocence. Love shivered. By exposing letters they didn't understand. Exactly, Purbright said. People rarely consider context when they think themselves righteous. Miss Overby might truly believe she acted to preserve Eunice's honor by showing the letters were never sent, never pursued. A demonstration of loyalty, not of disgrace. Love shook his head. But how do we prove it, sir? We don't need proof tonight, Purbright replied. We need understanding, and understanding requires observation. We shall visit the church. They turned down the worn path that led to St. Mildred's. The churchyard lay in near silence, the gravestones rising like witnesses to secrets too old to matter but too enduring to vanish. The faint glow from the vestry window revealed movement within shadows, gliding with deliberate care. Purbright approached the door, pausing only a moment before knocking. The shuffling within ceased. After a brief hesitation, the door opened to reveal Miss Overby, her face pale and alert, her hands still holding a neatly folded length of ribbon, the very same shade of faded blue that had tied Eunice Carble's letters. "Inspector," she said softly, as though caught between apology and fear. "You're out late." Purbright regarded her with gentle solemnity. "Yes, Miss Overby. And so it seems are you." Her eyes flickered to the ribbon as though it had betrayed her. "I was tidying the vestry," she murmured. "Just tidying." Purbright stepped inside, the air warm with candlelight and scented faintly of lilies. Miss Overby seemed to shrink beneath his gaze, her usual brisk movements replaced by fragile stillness. "Miss Overby," he said quietly, "when did you last visit Mrs. Carble's home?" Her breath staggered, barely perceptible. And in the silence that followed, the truth began to take shape, not yet spoken, but trembling at the edge of confession. Miss Overby's breath trembled just enough for Purbright to sense the delicate fissure forming in her composure. The vestry candles flickered, their wavering light making the brass candlesticks seem to lean closer, as though eager to overhear her answer. Purbright allowed the silence to linger, gently but deliberately, giving her space to step into the truth rather than be pushed toward it. Love, standing by the door with an awkward attempt at discretion, held his notebook as though it might steady the tremor in the air. Miss Overby clasped the faded blue ribbon tighter, the fabric pressing into her fingers like a confession waiting to be shaped. "I visited the house the morning after Eunice passed," she murmured. "Mrs. Albury asked me to help lay out flowers and ensure everything was tidy before Mr. Carble returned from the undertaker." Purbright nodded slowly, encouraging. "And did you tidy?" "I did, of course. Eunice was a dear woman. She deserved a proper farewell." "But you found something," Purbright prompted gently. "Something that unsettled you." Her face tightened, a small, brittle movement. "I found the letters in her wardrobe. I thought at first they were old receipts or notes she planned to discard. When I saw what they were," her voice trailed off, trembling with a conflict between loyalty and indignation. "I didn't know what to think. Eunice was gentle, too gentle for disappointment, too loyal to admit it, even to herself." Purbright stepped closer, keeping his tone soft. "And you believed someone had misled her?" Miss Overby shook her head sharply. No, Eunice wasn't misled. She was lonely, and loneliness can turn even the mildest affection into something larger inside a person's mind. She was writing to a man who barely noticed her beyond polite library chatter. It wasn't love. It was a wishful warmth, a comfort she didn't have at home. Love swallowed, oddly moved by the rawness in her words. Purbright remained still, watching carefully. "You feared the town would misunderstand?" "Yes." Miss Overby's voice cracked with sudden intensity. "They gossip, Inspector. They twist. If anyone had found those letters after the funeral, If they'd thought she had been unfaithful, it would have stained her memory. And Mr. Carble, he would have suffered disgrace he hadn't earned. Purbright absorbed this quietly. So you decided to reveal the letters yourself? Her face collapsed into bewildered distress. No, not revealed. Not truly. I placed the box where people would see it. Yes, but I believed they would hand it straight to someone who could protect Eunice's dignity. I thought you would take it, Inspector. I thought the very sight of that box would prompt someone responsible to shield her memory. Purbright's gaze softened with a mixture of pity and understanding. You did not expect the box to open in front of the mourners. No, she whispered. I didn't think it would fall. I placed it at the foot of the flowers, discreetly, carefully. I thought it would be found after the service, not during it. I wanted to ensure Eunice's letters reached someone who would understand them, someone who would keep them quiet. I never wanted theatrics. I only wanted to protect her. Purbright felt the honesty in her voice, its tremulous edges, its earnest desperation. Love shifted, slightly, glancing at Purbright for guidance, but the inspector did not speak yet. He waited, letting Miss Overby's explanation settle with the weight such revelations deserved. You acted out of affection, Purbright said gently, and fear. She nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Eunice confided in Mrs. Albury more than she ever confided in Mr. Carble, but even she did not speak of feeling unseen. I overheard her once, telling Mrs. Albury that she felt like a shadow in her own home. I thought perhaps these letters were the only place she felt bright. Purbright's expression softened, and you worried those private words would be misunderstood. I did. The town can be cruel when it believes itself right. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a reassuring murmur. Miss Overby, the letters do not reveal scandal. Only longing, only gentleness. You have not destroyed Eunice's memory, but you must understand that placing the box where you did has caused more confusion than protection. She bowed her head, trembling. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not Edgar. He adored Eunice in his quiet way. He didn't know how to show it, but he felt things deeply. Purbright exchanged a brief glance with Love. Did Mr. Carble know you'd found the letters? No, she whispered. He arrived after I'd placed them back into the box. I took the ribbon because I thought she might have hesitated. Belonged to her final remembrance. I didn't know it would make things worse. Purbright nodded subtly. And did you tell Mrs. Albury? Miss Overby hesitated. I hinted. She's perceptive. She sensed something was wrong. She asked whether I had found anything. I was frightened to admit it. So I said nothing directly. Purbright thought for a long moment. Someone else opened that box, Miss Overby. Someone made sure the letters lay where the town could see them. She looked up sharply. Not me. I swear it. I placed the box beneath the wreath. It was hidden from sight. Only someone who moved the flowers would have seen it. Purbright felt a quiet shift in the investigation, the subtle tilt that occurs when a puzzle reveals a new face. Love frowned. Someone adjusting the wreaths? Miss Overby nodded vigorously. Yes. The undertaker's assistant rearranged them just before the coffin was lowered. He said the arrangement looked uneven. Purbright felt his thoughts aligning with careful inevitability. A final gesture. A last-minute repositioning. A moment in which private things became public through hands that believed themselves performing a duty. Thank you, Miss Overby, he said softly. You've helped us understand far more than you realize. But as he and Love stepped back into the cool night air, Love asked the question already hovering at the edge of Purbright's mind. Sir, do you think the undertaker's assistant moved the box deliberately? Purbright exhaled, his breath a faint mist in the dark. I think, Love, someone moved that wreath with a very clear intention. And I think that person believed the truth, however incomplete, ought to serve their own sense of order. Love shivered. Someone who wanted the town to see exactly what Eunice left behind. Precisely, Purbright murmured. And tomorrow, love, we shall find out who benefits most from that revelation. Morning crept gently into Flaxborough, dissolving the last of the mist into thin strands that clung to rooftops and hedgerows as though reluctant to loosen their hold. Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, moving with quiet purpose while the town itself slowly stirred awake, preparing to resume its rituals of gossip and routine. Love joined him a few minutes later, clutching a half-folded newspaper and wearing the anxious expectancy of someone bracing for news they could neither fully predict nor entirely avoid. "Sir," Love said, setting the newspaper on the desk, "they're already talking about the box, about the letters. Some of them think Eunice had a secret lover. Others think she was being blackmailed. And Mrs. Grimbley said, well, she said it was a moral decline of the modern age, and likely the post office's fault." Purbright gave a patient nod, accustomed to Flaxborough's uncanny talent for attaching blame to unrelated institutions. The more elaborate the rumor, Love, the less likely it is to be true. The simplest explanations, however inconvenient, are usually the ones we should attend to. Love frowned. But we still don't know who moved that wreath. Or why. Purbright closed the mahogany box with deliberate precision. We know enough to begin asking the right questions rather than the convenient ones. Today, love, we visited the undertaker. The funeral parlor stood at the edge of town, dignified in its austerity, the paintwork immaculate and the curtains perpetually half-drawn as though shielding grief from sunlight. Mr. Tolland, the undertaker himself, greeted them with a solemnity that bordered on theatrical discipline. He was a man constructed from quietness, his face arranged into an expression of respectful neutrality that had no difficulty accommodating any emotion others attempted to place upon it. "Inspector Purbright," he said, inclining his head. "A somber morning to you both. How may I be of assistance?" Purbright returned the nod. "Mr. Tolland, we wish to ask you about the arrangements at Mrs. Carble's funeral yesterday. In particular, the flowers." Tolland's expression did not change, but his eyebrows performed the faintest lift, a gesture of interest rather than alarm. "Ah, the matter of the box, I assume." "Precisely. We understand your assistant adjusted the wreaths shortly before the coffin was lowered." Indeed she did. Tolland clasped his hands with careful respect. "Miss Grieve is diligent to a fault." She noticed that the floral arrangement had shifted slightly out of alignment. "Aesthetic balance," she says, "offers comfort in moments of sorrow." She adjusted the wreath, and, shortly after, the box was discovered. Purbright felt the soft click of confirmation settling into place. "May we speak with Miss Grieve?" Tolland nodded and disappeared through a heavy curtain at the back. After a moment, Miss Grieve emerged, a thin, sharp-featured woman with the expression of someone who took the solemn responsibilities of death very seriously. Her gaze flicked to the inspector with brisk curiosity. "Inspector, Sergeant, you wished to know about the flowers?" Purbright nodded. "Miss Grieve, when you adjusted the wreath at Mrs. Carble's funeral, did you notice the mahogany box?" Grieve paused, considering. "I did, but I thought it belonged there. Someone must have placed it with intention. Everything placed at a funeral holds meaning. I assumed the family wished it to be seen, but it was hidden beneath the flowers." She nodded again, matter of fact. Hidden, yes, but only because the wreath had shifted. Once straightened, the box appeared. A symbolic gesture, I suppose. Purbright studied her expression. "Miss Grieve, did anyone instruct you to adjust the flowers?" "No one instructs me, Inspector. I ensure dignity where I see disorder." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Carble looked quite distressed when he arrived." I thought perhaps the arrangement might offer reassurance. The little things matter. Purbright's gaze sharpened. You spoke to Mr. Carble before the funeral began? Briefly. He seemed troubled. He asked if the coffin could be lowered quickly after the service, as he did not wish to prolong the moment. People often speak strangely in grief. Love scribbled, then looked up. Did he ask you to move anything else? Any flowers? Any personal items? Grieve shook her head firmly. No, Sergeant. But he handled one of the wreaths himself, the one from the neighbors, I believe. He adjusted it slightly when he arrived. Purbright exchanged a quiet look with Love. Mr. Carble had touched the same wreath Miss Grieve later corrected, unintentionally revealing what lay beneath. Thank you, Miss Grieve, Purbright said softly. You've clarified more than you know. Back outside, Love exhaled. Sir, if Mr. Carble moved the wreath first, could he have been trying to hide the box? Or to reveal it? Purbright walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Carble acted from confusion, not strategy. He tried to straighten a wreath because grief often seeks order, but he did not know what lay beneath. Someone else placed the box. Someone who knew precisely that Miss Grieve's perfectionism would bring it into view. Love blinked. Someone who counted on her adjusting it. Indeed. Someone familiar with funerals. Someone who attends regularly. Someone who knows Miss Grieve's habits as intimately as those of the mourners. Love stared at him. Sir, that's Tolland. He attends every funeral. He sees every mourner. He hears every whisper. He knows when something will be noticed. Purbright nodded gently, though not triumphantly. Mr. Tolland understands dignity, but he also understands theatre. He believes revelations belong in moments weighted by ritual, not for cruelty, but for closure, for balance. Love hesitated, uncertain. But why would he want the letters revealed at all? Purbright's voice softened. Because Mr. Tolland has known this town long enough to see what unspoken longing does to people. Perhaps he believed Mrs. Carble deserved, finally, to be seen, to have her loneliness acknowledged instead of buried. Love's expression softened with reluctant understanding. You think he acted out of compassion? Compassion mixed with judgment, Purbright murmured. A dangerous combination, and one that often mistakes interference for insight. They walked on, the town spreading before them in soft morning light. Purbright's thoughts moved with steady clarity now, shaped not by suspicion alone, but by the quiet understanding of human frailty, its sadness, its earnestness, its misguided attempts at kindness. Love spoke quietly. So what do we do now, sir? Purbright looked toward the church spire rising through the thinning mist. Now, Love, we gather everyone touched by those letters, and we allow the truth simple, unadorned to rest where it has always belonged, at Eunice Carble's name. By late afternoon, the mist had lifted entirely, leaving Flaxborough caught in that pale, uncertain sunlight that rendered even its most familiar corners strangely tentative. Purbright walked with measured steps along the footpath toward St. Mildred's once more. Love followed beside him, attempting to arrange his notes into something coherent, though the threads of motive and misunderstanding still drifted elusively through his thoughts. Sir, Love said, struggling with an unexpected crease in his notebook. If Mr. Tolland truly thought he was helping, why not give the letters directly to Mr. Carble? Or to Mrs. Albury? It seems a roundabout way using a public moment, of all things. Purbright smiled faintly at this. A direct approach requires confidence, Love, and compassion that wishes to remain unseen often prefers a gesture rather than a confrontation. Mr. Tolland has arranged countless farewells. He believes he understands the language of grief. He does not always understand those who must live with its aftermath. Love nodded slowly, though his brow remained knitted. They approached the vicarage where Purbright had invited those at the center of the matter. Mrs. Albury arrived first, seated already in a straight-backed chair, her posture taut with indignation and apprehension. Lionel Acton stood near the bookshelf, looking as though he wished the entire scene might dissolve into fiction and shelve itself neatly. Edgar Carbell sat quietly near the window, hands folded, his pale features drawn into the solemnity of a man reluctantly awaiting judgment, and Miss Overby perched at the edge of a pew, the blue ribbon folded tightly in her hand, eyes lowered. Mr. Tolland, unusually, was the last to arrive. He entered with a quiet gravity, greeting them with respectful nods, unaware, or perhaps very aware, that the room had been arranged with purpose. "Thank you all for coming," Purbright said, his voice gentle but carrying just enough firmness to gather their attention without strain. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss a delicate matter." Mrs. Albury lifted her chin. "If this concerns the unfortunate scene at Eunice's funeral, Inspector, I trust you intend to identify who disgraced her memory so thoroughly." Purbright regarded her with mild patience. "That is precisely what I intend to do, Mrs. Albury, though the nature of disgrace is sometimes more complicated than the act itself." He opened the mahogany box and placed it on the table before them. The sight of it stirred a wave of discomfort. Miss Overby's hands tightened around her ribbon. Mr. Carbell's gaze drifted away. Acton swallowed with a pain he could not quite conceal. Purbright continued. These letters, written by Mrs. Carbell, were never sent. They were private reflections of thoughts she did not share with anyone while she lived. They reveal no impropriety, no betrayal, no scandal, only a quiet longing for human tenderness. Acton closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders softening in gratitude. Mr. Carbell exhaled, the faintest tremor loosening his composure. Purbright turned slightly toward Miss Overby. These letters were found by someone who feared they would be misunderstood, someone who believed Eunice's memory must be guarded rather than allowed to drift into rumor. That person, acting with more fervor than wisdom, placed them at the funeral, intending they be found discreetly and delivered into responsible hands. Miss Overby's voice shook. "I meant only to protect her." Mrs. Albury gasped softly. "You, Margaret? You placed that box? How could you presume?" Purbright lifted a calming hand. Miss Overby acted out of love, though misguided. She intended privacy, not spectacle. The box was hidden beneath the wreath, positioned so that it would be found afterward. Acton looked from one to the other with dawning comprehension, but it wasn't found afterward. It fell. It created the worst possible scene. "Precisely," Purbright said. "And that is where intention met interference. Someone adjusted the flowers before the service, and someone else adjusted them again. Two innocent gestures creating one unfortunate result." Mrs. Albury looked bewildered. But who would adjust the flowers, other than Margaret? Purbright turned his gaze to Mr. Carbell. "You, sir, touched the wreath when you arrived." Carbell nodded slowly. Yes, the ribbon was loose. Eunice always disliked crooked arrangements. I meant only to fix it. "And Miss Grieve," Purbright continued, "adjusted it once more in the name of symmetry." Mr. Tolland's face tightened just slightly. "Miss Grieve is meticulous." "She is," Purbright agreed, "and I commend her dedication. But Miss Grieve would not have known. The box was there unless someone told her, or unless someone else ensured it would come to light." Tolland shifted, his precise composure faltering for the first time. "Inspector, you must understand funerals are delicate. The truth, when it concerns the dead, can weigh upon the living. I believed perhaps arrogantly that Eunice's loneliness deserved acknowledgement." Carbell stared at him, shocked. "Acknowledgement? She was my wife." Tolland bowed his head. "And you loved her, I know. But she suffered quietly. When she came here, he gestured vaguely toward the church in her last month, asking about memorial rites. She spoke of unshared feelings, of words she wished she had said. I thought it wrong that such tenderness should vanish without witness. Acton's voice trembled. So you exposed her? Not exposed, Toland said, his tone earnest. Revealed. Gently. Symbolically. A box placed where it would be found without fanfare. A tribute to her heart. Purbright's voice softened, carrying both understanding and admonition. But grief cannot be orchestrated, Mr. Toland, and privacy is not a commodity to arrange. Your gesture, however compassionate in intent, became a disturbance because you believed you knew the shape her truth should take. Mrs. Albury wiped her eyes. Poor Eunice, even now her gentle nature is being debated. Purbright closed the box with quiet finality. Eunice Carble harmed no one. Her letters show a tender imagination, nothing more. The harm came from those who assumed they knew how best to honor her by controlling the narrative she herself never wished to publish. A silence settled heavy, but not accusatory. It held the weight of human frailty rather than fault. Purbright rose. I ask only this. Let her memory rest in the dignity she lived with. Let her letters remain private as she intended, and let the truth serve humility, not vanity. Toland bowed deeply. I understand, Inspector, Miss Overby whispered, tearful. I only wanted her to be remembered kindly. Mr. Carble looked toward the window, eyes softening. She will be. Purbright inclined his head. Then our work here is done. And as they left the vicarage, Love whispered, almost in awe, So the town will quiet down now, won't it? Purbright gave a small, knowing smile. Love, Flaxborough never quiets. It simply rearranges its anxieties. But tonight, at least, it would rearrange them gently.